I'm just here to remind you guys that there's free tutoring for everyone on campus. Especially, I know this is kind of a harder class, so if you ever need it. In the ASC, A&P has a specific night on Wednesdays, so that's tonight. Otherwise, you can always fill out the form or reach out to me, Alyssa Burke, and then some other people do it. So, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd also like to just point out that tutoring is not necessarily just for those students who are having difficulty in classes. I've had students before that were A students that worked with tutors, and they were able to reinforce the learning by reviewing things with them. So don't think because you're working with a tutor necessarily means that you're not able to grasp the material very well. So even good students sometimes can help. One suggestion I know a lot of educational experts make for how to improve on tests is to study with other students from the same class. That helps too. You can quiz each other, you can test each other, you can learn your weaknesses and your strengths, and that usually is helpful as well. So, all right. So on Monday we took a look at the conduction system of the heart, which is made up of specialized cardiac muscle fibers that some of which in the SA node and the AV node are able to spontaneously depolarize by allowing sodium to leak into the cells, and those so when those cells do spontaneously depolarize, like the ones in the SA node, they send out signals causing the atria to contract. Those signals then stimulate the AV node. The signals go down through the rest of the conduction system and cause the ventricles to contract. So that electrical activity of the heart is responsible for the contraction, the alternating contraction of the atria and the ventricles, which causes blood to be pumped out of the heart. Well, causes blood to be pumped through the heart and then finally out of the heart. Now, in addition to that, this flow of blood through the heart also is responsible for producing the heart sounds that you can hear with a stethoscope if you listen to a person's chest. Those heart sounds are a result of vibrations in the heart due to the closing of the valves. Okay, and there's two heart sounds. We'll talk about those today. In some cases in children, there's a third heart sound. It's called produces what's called a gallop rhythm. That's normal in children and adolescents. It's not as common in adults, though. And so those contractions of the heart also cause the blood to flow through the body. We're going to talk about some of the factors that affect blood flow, because you need to understand the factors that affect blood flow in order to understand how blood pressure is regulated. Before we do that, though, I have a new question for you to do. You might have to look back in your notes a little bit to find the answer to this if you don't remember it. What part of the conduction system of the heart is responsible for a nodal rhythm? And I'll give you a hint. A nodal rhythm is not a normal rhythm. Okay, it usually results in a slower than normal heart rate. Okay, so what part of the heart produces that nodal rhythm? Okay, I just realized there might be two ways of interpreting this question, but what is it that causes the heart to contract during a nodal rhythm? That probably would be a better way of stating the question. That's really what I meant by this. last couple people to answer. What part of the conduction system of the heart is responsible for a normal cardiac rhythm? In other words, what's the normal pacemaker of the heart? The SA node, right, the SA node. And that heart rhythm, that normal rhythm that's produced by the SA node is called a sinus rhythm. Okay, that's what normally affects the heart. So a nodal rhythm is different. So let's see what you thought causes the nodal rhythm. Here is responsible for a nodal rhythm. Okay, most of you said SA node. Okay, that's what produces the normal rhythm, which is called a sinus rhythm. Sinus, refers to the sinoatrial node. AV node, or the nodal rhythm occurs when the SA node is not functioning properly, or it's not functioning at all. Then the AV node will take over as the pacemaker of the heart. The AV node depolarizes slower than the SA node, so that would result in a slower heart rate. Okay. All right, so today we're going to talk about, one of the things we're going to talk about is the cardiac cycle. The cardiac cycle consists of one complete cycle of contraction and relaxation. Mostly we talk about ventricles, because that's the part of the heart that pumps the blood. But keep in mind that the atria are contracting as well, so it involves contractions of all four chambers of the heart. That cardiac cycle produces two associated events. Those are pressure changes, which cause the valves to open and close, and in response to the valves opening and close, that also produces our heart sounds. Okay. Before we talk about the pressure changes in the heart itself, we need to take a look at some factors that affect blood flow. Okay. So blood flow occurs in response to a difference in pressure between 2 points. So, for example, up here on that, think of these little cylinders as being blood vessels. So on this cylinder up here at the top, the pressure on the left-hand side is higher than the pressure on the right-hand side. And blood, as well as any kind of fluid or even air, always flows from an area of higher pressure to lower pressure. So if the pressure is higher on the left-hand side of that tube than the right, then blood is going to flow from the left to the right. Okay? Blood always flows from higher pressure to lower pressure, which kind of makes sense. Now, this second diagram here, this shows that the pressure on both ends of this blood vessel is the same. Pressure is 100 millimeters mercury, which is the units they use to measure pressure. And since there's no difference in pressure, there would be no blood flow through that blood vessel. Blood would not flow. Okay. Then these last two blood vessels down here on the lower right hand of the diagram demonstrate that it's not the absolute pressure that determines the rate of blood flow, but it's the difference in pressure that determines how fast that blood is going to flow. Okay? So for example, if the pressure at one end of the blood vessel is 100 millimeters mercury, at the other end it's 75 millimeters mercury, the difference in pressure is 25 millimeters mercury. Okay? Since we have a pressure difference, then the blood's going to flow from the area of high pressure to low pressure, from left to right. Okay? Now, if we look at this blood vessel on the bottom, the pressure is much lower on the left-hand side. It's only 40. But it's also lower on the right-hand side. It's only 15. Well, if you subtract 40 from 15, you get a difference of 25 millimeters mercury. Same as the difference between these two pressures on the blood vessel just above. And so the amount of blood flow in both of these vessels is going to be the same. because blood flow is proportional to the difference in pressure, which is sometimes symbolized as delta P, Greek letter delta, which is shaped like a triangle. Okay, that means the difference in pressure between two areas. So one of the factors affecting blood flow is the pressure difference between two areas. And it's important to remember that blood always flows from an area of high pressure to low pressure, and the rate of flow is dependent upon the pressure difference or the pressure differential. Okay. So that's one factor that affects it. So pressure is usually measured in units of millimeter mercury. Now, millimeter mercury, they use those units because they used to put mercury in a manometer, which is used to measure air pressure. And air pressure will push a column of mercury up to a height of, let's see, what is it? What is normal air pressure? Can't remember the number now. Anyway, if you apply pressure at one side of the manometer, it's going to push the mercury column upward on the opposite side. And they measure the number of millimeters that column will rise in a manometer. So that's where they get the units of millimeters mercury. So if you attach an artery to one end of a manometer, the pressure of the blood going through that artery would push the mercury column up a certain distance, and so those units would be in millimeters mercury. Now, in addition to flow being proportional to the difference in pressure between two parts of a blood vessel, it's also inversely proportional to resistance. Resistance is going to tend to prevent blood flow, okay? So resistance will decrease blood flow. If you increase resistance, increasing the pressure differential would increase blood flow, all right? So one of the factors that greatly affects resistance is the radius of a blood vessel. Radius is half of the diameter of a blood vessel. Because resistance increases to the fourth power of the radius of a blood vessel. So for example, we have a cylinder of water here. It's filled with water. And near the bottom on one side we have a tube connected to this water in this column that has a radius of 1, let's say 1 millimeter. Okay. Over here we have another tube that's twice the radius of the other one. This one has a radius of 2. Okay. So what we've essentially done is we've doubled the radius of that tube that's similar to a blood vessel. Now, even though we've only doubled the radius, the blood flow increases to the fourth power of the radius. So the amount of water going through this larger diameter opening is going to be 16 times more than the smaller diameter one. So you can really greatly increase blood flow by increasing the diameter of a blood vessel, or you can greatly decrease it by decreasing the diameter. And you don't have to decrease it very much to greatly reduce blood flow. Okay? So blood flow is actually proportional to the radius of the blood vessel to the fourth power. Okay? So resistance is actually a much larger factor than the pressure difference between 2 points. And so one of the mechanisms that our body uses to regulate blood flow and blood pressure is to change the diameter of a blood vessel. And our body does this mainly through sympathetic stimulation of the smooth muscles in the walls of small arteries called arterioles. And that can greatly affect the flow of blood in various parts of the body. Okay, now, the reason we're talking about these factors that affect blood flow is that the opening and closing of the valves is dependent almost entirely on pressure differences between the two chambers. Okay? So during diastole, which is the phase of ventricular relaxation, the ventricles are relaxing, and as they relax, they expand. And when the ventricles expand, the pressure inside that cavity inside that ventricle drops. Because anytime you increase the volume of a closed space, causes a drop in pressure. So when the pressure in the ventricles drops at the beginning diastole, when the pressure in the ventricles drops below the pressure in the atria, then blood is going to flow from the area of higher pressure to lower pressure, and that flow of blood is going to push open the AV valves, like the tricuspid valve that you see here. Okay, so the valves open when the pressure in the atrium is greater than the pressure in the ventricles. Then the AV valves open. Okay. Now, during systole, the ventricles start contracting, and it starts squeezing down the size of the space inside the ventricles. And when you decrease the volume of a closed space, that causes the pressure to increase. So at the beginning of systole, the pressure in the ventricles is going to start increasing. When the pressure in the ventricles gets higher than the pressure in the atria, then that blood pressure in the ventricles is going to push against the AV valves, and it's going to cause them to close. So when the pressure in the ventricles is higher than the pressure in the atria, the AV valves are going to close. And that makes the first heart sound when those close. Now, the heart sounds are not caused directly by the closing of the valves. That sound you hear with a stethoscope is not the cusps of the valves slapping closed. The sounds that you hear are actually vibrations in the walls of the ventricles due to the closing of the valves. Okay, when those valves close, the walls of the ventricles sort of reverberate, they shake, and that produces the lub sound that you hear with the stethoscope. That's called the first heart sound. Okay. Now, likewise, the semilunar valves also open and close in response to pressure differences. In this case, though, it's the pressure difference between the ventricles and the pressure in the pulmonary trunk and the aorta. Okay? So during systole, which is ventricular contraction, that's shown here on the left, when the ventricles start contracting and they start squeezing that blood in the ventricles, the pressure in the ventricles is going to start to increase. When the pressure in the ventricles becomes higher than the pressure in the pulmonary trunk and the aorta, then the blood is going to push open the semilunar valves. And the semilunar valves will open and blood will flow out of the ventricles through the semilunar valves. Okay? Then, during diastole, when the ventricles are relaxing, they start expanding in size, and that expansion causes the pressure to drop. The larger volume causes a drop in pressure. And when the pressure in the ventricles falls below the pressure of the blood in the pulmonary trunk and the aorta, then the semilunar valves close. Okay? Because the higher pressure in those blood vessels pushes down on the top of the semilunar valves, and it forces those valves closed. Okay. That way, blood that's in those blood vessels can't move backwards back into the ventricles again. So that way, the blood flows out of the heart, but then it can't go back again into the heart where it came from. So that ensures that the blood flows in the proper direction. So, in a similar way, when the pressure in the pulmonary trunk is greater than the pressure in the ventricles, then the semilunar valves close. And when those semilunar valves close, that causes vibrations in the heart and those large blood vessels, which produce a little sharper sound. It's usually described as a dup sound. And that's the second heart sound. Second heart sound is associated, it's not directly caused by the closing of the semilunar valves, but it's indirectly caused by the closing of the semilunar valves. The sound you hear is due to vibrations in those two large blood vessels as well as in the heart. It used to be they'd say that the sounds are caused by the valves closing. And that was it. But it's really, you're not really hearing the valves closing, you're hearing vibrations caused by the valves closing. It's a subtle distinction. So the first heart sound is described as a lub sound. It's a kind of a lower sound that's associated with the closing of the AV valves. The second heart sound is sometimes described as a dup. It's a little sharper sound, and that's associated with closing of the semilunar valves. Occasionally in children and adolescents, you'll hear a third heart sound that produces what's called a gallop rhythm, or a triple rhythm. And that's normal in children and adolescents, but it could be a sign of a failing heart in people that are over 30. Okay. So the author of our textbook describes this gallop rhythm being like tapping your fingers on a table, and you probably won't be able to hear me do this, but a normal rhythm would be like taking two fingers, and you're not going to be able to hear it, but like taking two fingers and tapping on a wooden table. I can do it in my office and I can hear it, but I can't hear much in here. It'd be like tapping two fingers. A gallop rhythm would be like tapping three fingers in sequence, like on a table. Okay, so I think that's it's a good concrete example of the difference. Now there's also another kind of sound that is occasionally heard in some people. It's caused by blood leaking through one of the AV valves, and that's called a heart murmur. If the valves don't completely close, if there's it could be because of a defect in one of the cusps of the valve. Anything that causes blood to leak back through the valve after the valve closes produces what's called a heart murmur. And I'm not a medical doctor, so I don't routinely listen to people's hearts. So I'm not sure of what a heart murmur sounds like, but supposedly you can sort of hear a swishing sound when the blood leaks through the valve, in addition to the normal heart sounds. Okay, that's called a heart murmur. Some people have heart murmurs that are not that severe, that they don't allow much blood leak through. It usually doesn't cause any problems. If too much blood leaks through, though, then it can compromise the function of the heart, and they do sometimes have to do a repair or a replacement of the valve. All right, now, in addition to the two major phases of the cardiac cycle, which are systole and diastole, physiologists also break down those two cycles into what I like to call subphases. Okay, they break them down even further into smaller phases. So this is a series of diagrams that shows all of the smaller subphases of the cardiac cycle. And these first two phases start out with diastole, which is the relaxation of the ventricles. Okay, so right at the very beginning of diastole, when the ventricles are beginning to relax, due to the expansion of the volume of the ventricles, the pressure in the ventricles drops. When the pressure in the ventricles drops below that of the atria, the AV valves open, and blood passively flows from each atrium into the corresponding ventricle, just due to the pressure differences. Okay? So there's sort of three stages to this so-called ventricular filling. The first stage, which is about the first third of diastole, is called rapid filling. That's when blood is flowing rapidly from each atrium to the ventricle on the same side of the heart. Okay, blood flows rapidly because of the large pressure differences between the atrium and the ventricle. Okay. The second third of diastole is called diastasis. Okay, I used to pronounce it diastasis, but I looked in the textbook and they say it's diastasis. Okay, diastasis is when blood flows into the ventricle starts slowing down, because as blood flows into the ventricle, the pressure differences decreases. Pressure starts increasing in the ventricle as blood flows in there. So diastasis is just when blood flow into the ventricles starts slowing down, okay, because it's starting to get full. Then the last third of diastole is called atriosystole. That's where the signals from the SA node stimulate the cardiac muscle fibers in the atria to contract. The atria both contract. Actually, the right atrium contracts a little bit earlier than the left ventricle. Not much difference, but just a little bit sooner. And so that causes the atria to contract, which is called atriosystole. And so the atria actually pumps some additional blood into the ventricles. But that's only during the last third of diastole. So most of the blood that flows into the ventricles does so passively during rapid filling and diastasis. The atriosystole only adds a smaller amount to the total volume that fills the ventricles. Okay, so those two, so this passive filling, this rapid filling and diastasis, that sometimes is called passive filling, because blood is flowing passively. The second phase is called atriosystole. That's when blood is actually pumped out of the atria into the ventricles. Okay, so the end of atriosystole then marks the end of diastole, and then the heart goes into systole. Right at the very beginning of systole, the ventricles first start contracting. The pressure in the ventricles gradually starts to increase. And for a very short period of time near the beginning of systole, the pressure in the ventricles rises above the pressure in the atria, causing the AV valves to close. Now, the AV valves actually close before the semilunar valves open. So the pressure in the ventricles has increased enough to cause the AV valves to close, but it hasn't increased above the pressure in the pulmonary trunk of the aorta. And so for a brief period, maybe less than a second, all four valves are closed. The AV valves have already closed, but the semilunar valves have not yet opened yet. So all four valves are closed. Now, if all four valves are closed, can there be any blood flow through the heart? No, you can't. If they're all the doors are shut, you can't get any blood flow. So the volume in the chambers of the heart are going to be the same during that period of time. And so right near the beginning of systole, the stage where all 4 valves are closed is called isovolumetric contraction. Iso means same, and volumetric refers to the volume. So during isovolumetric contraction, there's no blood flow through the heart, so the volumes are staying the same. That's where you get isovolumetric contraction, because it's the beginning of systole. It's when the ventricles start contracting. Okay. So isovolumetric contraction only takes place for a very short period of time, just a brief moment. And then when the ventricles continue to contract during systole, the pressure inside the ventricles increase even more. And when the pressure in the ventricles increases above that of the pulmonary trunk and the aorta, then the semilunar valves open. And that results in ventricular ejection. When the semilunar valves open, blood flows from the higher pressure in the ventricles to the lower pressure in the pulmonary trunk and the aorta, and that causes blood to be ejected from the heart under pressure. Okay? So that's actually what produces the pressure, is the blood being pushed into the arteries. Okay, now, right near the end of systole, when the ventricles stop contracting and they start relaxing again, the pressure in the ventricles starts to decrease. When the pressure in the ventricles decreases below that of the atria, then the AV valves close. But now let's see. No, I'm sorry, it's the other way around. The AV valves are already closed, okay, because the pressure is higher in the ventricles than the atria during systole. So when the ventricles start relaxing, the pressure starts dropping in the ventricles. When the pressure in the ventricles drops below that, yeah, I said that right the first time, above the atria, then the AV valves open again. Okay, but for a split second, right near the beginning of diastole, again, all 4 valves are closed, and so that's called the isovolumetric relaxation phase. That occurs right at the very beginning of diastole. Okay, since all 4 valves are closed, no blood can flow through the heart, and so the volume of the chambers is going to remain the same. That's the isovolumetric relaxation. So there's 2 isovolumetric phases. There's one at the beginning of systole and one right at the beginning of diastole. Okay. So I suppose if you split up this first passive filling phase into rapid filling and diastasis, you counted that as 2 separate subphases. There's really, what, 1, 2, 3, 4, there's really 6 subphases, or 5, depending on how you want to look at it. You combine rapid filling and diastasis as passive filling, then there's only 5 stages. So, I really think it's a good thing to know what's happening in each of these 5 subphases that are shown here. So, I want you to know which valves are open, which ones are closed in each of these subphases. And I want you to understand why. Why are they open? Why are they closed? It has to do with the pressures in the chambers of the heart, as well as the pressure in the pulmonary trunk and the aorta. Okay. Any questions? So once systole ends and the heart goes into isometric relaxation, then the cycle starts over again. Okay. The cycle just keeps going over and over and over again for a person's entire lifespan, and the heart never gets tired unless it doesn't get enough oxygen. Then it's going to get tired. Normally though, your heart is supplied with enough, unless you have coronary artery disease, where your coronary arteries start getting blocked. Then your heart's going to get have problems. Okay, let me show you an example of a question about the cardiac cycle. This is an example of a type of question I might ask. I probably won't ask the exact same question on the test, but it'll be something similar to this. Okay, so the question is, which of the following is true concerning the rapid filling phase of diastole, also known as the passive filling phase? Okay. Is the pressure in the ventricles higher than the pressure in the atria? Is the pressure in the atria lower than the pressure in the ventricles? Is the pressure in the ventricles lower than the pressure in the atria? Or is the pressure in the ventricles the same as the pressure in the atria? So you need to think about what each of these chambers is doing during that time, and how that's going to affect the pressures, and whether the blood is flowing or not during that phase. Now there's two ways of solving a problem like this. You could try to memorize the answers to every possible scenario you could have, or you could try to understand the factors that affect pressures and how that affects blood flow. Personally, I think it's better to understand the pressure changes and how that affects blood flow, because that'll allow you to answer just about any question. I don't think you can. I think it'd be a lot harder to try to memorize every possible scenario. You just can't do that, and your memory will fail you. But if you remember a few things about, the relationship between pressure and volume and blood flow, you can use that information to solve just about any problem like this. So that's my goal, is to have you understand this, not just come up with the correct answer. All right, let's look at your answers. It was almost a unanimous answer on that, and that's correct. Correct answer is the pressure in the ventricles is lower than the pressure in the atria. In other words, the pressure in the atria is higher than the pressure in the ventricles. Since blood always flows from an area of higher pressure to lower pressure, the blood's going to flow down into the ventricles and fill the ventricles with blood. Here's another one. Here's another sample question. This is asking about what's happening during one of the phases of the cardiac cycle. Which of the following is true concerning ventricular ejection? And this is asking again about the pressures involved. This one's probably a little easier, I think. Not that the last one was that hard. take a look at the results. Nearly unanimous again for number 2, and that's correct. When the ventricles start to contract, it compresses that blood in the ventricles. That causes the semilunar valves to open, and blood is ejected from the heart. When the pressure in the ventricles rises above the pressure in the pulmonary trunk and the aorta, then blood is going to flow from the ventricle out the 2 large vessels at the top of the heart. And actually, during ventricular ejection, that's when the pressure in the ventricles is the highest. That's when the walls of the ventricles are squeezing down on that blood and putting it under pressure. All right, here's another one. Which of the following is true concerning isovolumetric ventricular relaxation? This is a little harder one because more than one of these could be correct. What I do when I answer a question like this, I think about, okay, what's the ventricles doing? Are they relaxing? Are they contracting? How that's going to affect the pressure, and then how that's going to affect the valves. And then so then I pick the statements that are true. Let's take a look at your responses. Majority you picked number 5, and that's correct. Okay, because number 2 says the pressure in the atria is less than the pressure in the ventricles. Okay, that's what keeps the AV valves closed. Number 3 is the pressure in the left ventricle is lower than the pressure in the aorta. That's what keeps the semilunar valves closed. That's the only way you can have all 4 valves closed, if those 2 things are true. Okay. So these are some examples. I'm not going to ask very many of these questions like this, but I may ask 1 or 2 questions similar to this about those different phases of the cardiac cycle. The most important thing to know, though, is the definitions of systole and diastole. Okay, and that's pretty straightforward. Systole refers to ventricular contractions. Diastole refers to ventricular relaxations. Okay, next what I'd like to do is show you a little video clip that puts together the electrical activity of the heart that travels through the conduction system with the cardiac cycle. So you can see the relationship between the electrical stimulation of the heart with the cardiac cycle, which is caused when the cardiac muscle fibers contract.
The cardiac cycle is made up of the events associated with one heartbeat. Each cardiac cycle takes about 0.8 of 1 second. During each cardiac cycle, pressure changes occur within the chambers of the heart as they relax and contract. As the chambers relax, they fill with blood. This is called diastole. When the chambers contract, the blood is expelled. This is called systole. At the beginning of the cardiac cycle, the atrioventricular, or AV valves, open. This allows blood to begin to flow into the ventricles from the atria. At the same time, the pulmonary and aortic valves are closed, preventing blood in the pulmonary trunk and aorta from entering the ventricles. Ventricular filling is completed by atrial systole or contraction. This contraction results from a series of events beginning with the spread of action potentials from the sinuatrial or SA node across the walls of the atria. This results in atrial depolarization, which is represented by the P wave on the electrocardiogram, also called an ECG or EKG. Atrial depolarization initiates contraction or systole. Atrial systole is represented by the PQ segment on the ECG. Near the end of atrial systole, impulses from the SA node reach the AV node. At this time, impulses spread from the AV node along the ventricular conduction fibers to the walls of the ventricles. This results in ventricular depolarization, which is represented by the QRS complex on the ECG. The atria repolarize, the walls relax, and they remain in diastole for the rest of the cardiac cycle. Atrial repolarization is not seen on an ECG because it is masked by the QRS complex. In ventricular systole, or contraction, increased pressure in the ventricles forces the AV valves closed. The heart sound associated with the closure of the AV valves is known as S1, often described as lub. With continued contraction, ventricular pressures increase until they are higher than those in the pulmonary trunk and aorta. At this point, the pulmonary and aortic valves open and blood is ejected from the ventricles. Ventricular systole is represented by the ST segment on the ECG. In ventricular diastole, or relaxation, the ventricles repolarize. The T wave on an ECG represents ventricular repolarization. Ventricular relaxation results in decreasing ventricular pressure. During ventricular diastole, blood in the pulmonary trunk and aorta flows back toward the semilunar valves, causing them to close. The heart sound associated with closure of the aortic and pulmonary valves is known as S2, often described as dub. After the aortic and pulmonary valves close, pressure in the ventricles continues to decrease. When intraventricular pressure falls below the pressure in the atria, the AV valves open and the cardiac cycle begins again.
Okay, that puts together the electrical activity of the heart with the cardiac cycle, which is what pumps the blood through the body. So, all right, we're about out of time, so we'll stop here. And we'll start talking about blood vessels, I think, on Friday.